Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. It was one of those golden September mornings when the village of Larkspur Hollow seemed wrapped in eternal peace, as though time had graciously forgotten it. The sun shone gently through the wisps of morning mist, illuminating gabled roofs, carefully trimmed hedges, and the ripening hedgerows that walled in the narrow lanes. At the heart of this tranquil picture sat a modest stone manor house known as Ferndale, a place that had recently passed into the curious hands of Mrs. Anthea Bradford, a widow newly arrived from London, whose wealth was spoken of in the hushed, speculative tones reserved for lottery winners and women who had been very comfortable, even before the war. This morning, Ferndale was host to a much-discussed affair, a charity garden tea for the restoration of St. Peter's bell tower, which had cracked just after Easter and was now held together, as Mr. Denby the vicar often said, by little more than divine will and heavy rope. Anthea Bradford was a woman who relished the art of display. From the lace-draped trestle tables to the copper samovars, she had arranged every detail with theatrical precision. She stood now beside a low table displaying the prize of the afternoon's charity raffle, an elaborate, exquisitely carved antique dollhouse, purportedly Georgian, complete with tiny oil paintings, working chandeliers, and minuscule books no bigger than thumbnails. An heirloom, she said, for the third time to anyone who wandered close. My late husband purchased it in Bath, from an antiquarian with a limp. Paid a small fortune, but of course the real value is sentimental. The dollhouse sat at the edge of the tablecloth like a sacred artifact, surrounded by raffle tickets and well-meaning curiosity. Miss Jane Marple, who had been observing the proceedings from the shade of a lilac bush, turned her gentle gaze to the dollhouse. She had already noted something curious. It had 7 rooms, 3 upstairs, 3 down, and 1 attic. But no kitchen, no scullery, pantry, or servants' quarters. No indication that such essentials had ever existed. Odd, she thought. People often forget to replicate plumbing or wiring in these things, but never the kitchen. The kitchen is, in most houses, the place things simmer. Still, she said nothing, merely sipped her tepid tea and watched. The village had turned out in full force. There was the ever-chatty Mrs. Lestrange, recently widowed and even more prone to florid storytelling. Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden, who ran the village grocer and whose marriage had long since settled into cold civility. Young Alice Denby, daughter of the vicar, wearing gloves a size too small and a hopeful look reserved for Captain Mark Allerton, a retired RAF man with a limp and a dark secret, or so it was said. Miss Marple saw it all. Quietly. She had never been one for gossip, but she understood its utility. People liked to speak in half-truths and coded glances. If you listened, not just to words, but to what wasn't said, you could hear the truth clattering in the silences. It was at precisely 4:30, just as Mrs. Lestrange was retelling her tale about a haunted cuckoo clock in Salzburg, that the first scream echoed across the garden. High, piercing, human. Guests froze. Teacups mid-air. Miss Marple stood, slowly. The scream had come from inside the house, from the drawing-room, which Anthea Bradford had closed off earlier in the afternoon, explaining that a valuable set of Japanese lacquer boxes was being temporarily stored there, and she couldn't have the vicar's youngest knocking them over in a fit of religious zeal. But now, the drawing-room door stood wide open. Alice Denby was the one who had screamed. She stood trembling in the doorway, one gloved hand pressed to her mouth, the other still clutching the long-necked brass doorknob. On the Aubusson carpet inside lay a man, a stranger to most, but not to all, Captain Mark Allerton. His head was twisted unnaturally to one side, his eyes wide and unfocused. On his shirt front, below the stiff collar, a dark blossom of blood spread outward like a poppy in bloom. Alice stumbled backward as Mr. Chittenden rushed past her, followed by Mrs. Lestrange and the vicar himself. There were gasps, flurries of whispered "good heavens" and "call someone," and the unmistakable whiff of fear that moves like damp through a crowd. But Miss Marple did not follow. She remained in the garden, still as a finch on a stone wall, her blue eyes narrowing just slightly. Her hand hovered for a moment above the untouched slice of Victoria sponge on her plate, then dropped to her lap. Mrs. Anthea Bradford, face pale but voice unshaken, declared sharply that no one is to leave the premises and that the police must be called at once. Miss Marple turned her head slightly toward the dollhouse on the raffle table. It had been moved, only by inches, but enough for her to notice. And now, yes, now it had 8 rooms. Or rather, it had always had 8. Only someone had taken great care to make one of them appear hidden. Her eyes fixed on the smallest door, almost too small for a doll, cleverly set into the wood paneling of the attic wall. Not a nursery, not a dressing room. No, it was a room made for secrets. Chapter 2. The village reacts, gossip and theories. By early evening, the bunting still fluttered from the hedgerows, though no one seemed to remember what it had been strung for. Ferndale had emptied quickly, like a picnic interrupted by thunder. Yet the village of Larkspur Hollow did not retreat in silence. No, it folded inward, as small villages always do in the face of scandal, each house a clam murmuring beneath its shell. The news spread with impossible speed, faster even than Mr. Sart's. Forbes's ancient delivery bicycle could have managed. Captain Mark Allerton, recently returned, recently limping, recently charming, was dead. Murdered in Mrs. Bradford's drawing room during the garden tea. Poison? Stabbing. No one knew for certain, but everyone spoke with utter certainty. At the Greystone Arms, the village's sole pub and chief repository of late-night speculation, a quorum of locals gathered, most with unfinished pints in hand, heads pressed close, voices low. The landlord, Mr. Prowse, was uncharacteristically tolerant of those who hadn't paid yet. Murder was, after all, a sort of public holiday in a place like this. Grim, fascinating, and oddly galvanizing. "I heard it was the vicar's daughter," said young Ned Flax, the postman, who had never spoken more than 3 words to Alice Denby, but now swore he had seen something odd in her eye since Easter. "Nonsense," snapped Mrs. Cribbs, the butcher's widow. "She's the type that faints at the sight of a paper cut. No spine in her. If anything, I'd wager it was Mrs. Bradford herself. That house is full of locked doors and secrets. Fancy widow like that, moving in without a proper background. No one knows where she came from or what her late husband died of." "Heart failure, wasn't it?" asked someone. "That's what she says." "Mark Allerton didn't look like he was failing from anything," muttered Mr. Dinch, who ran the hardware shop. "Bit too full of himself, if you ask me. Always tapping that stick, always leaning in too close to the women. Wouldn't be surprised if he tried something and got what was coming." This was greeted with grim nods and the sort of collective grunt that passes for agreement in a pub. Across the green, in a neatly kept sitting room lined with old gardening catalogues and one framed photograph of the late king, Miss Jane Marple sat with a fresh pot of tea and no sugar. She did not speculate aloud. She never did. But she had been thinking steadily since the scream. A visitor arrived, Miss Prudence Prue Weatherby, who lived 2 doors down and styled herself the unofficial historian of Larkspur Hollow. She had appeared at Miss Marple's gate the moment dusk fell, bearing a covered plate of seed cake and an appetite for shared whispers. "Well," Prue said breathlessly, settling into the fireside chair, "wasn't it dreadful? Positively medieval." The poor man lying there with his eyes open, and blood on the hearthrug. Alice Denby's gone quite pale. Mrs. Lestrange says she screamed like a banshee and had to be given smelling salts. Miss Marple poured tea in silence. "Of course," Prue continued, eyes gleaming. "It's common knowledge that Anthea Bradford and Captain Allerton were seen walking together last Thursday. very cosy-like near the footpath by Widow's Hollow. They say she took his arm, and you know what people say about a woman of means and a man with no prospects. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly, but said nothing. Still, Prue went on, dropping her voice to a whisper that strained the definition, I heard from Mr. Chittenden that someone else had words with the captain recently. Something about a loan never repaid. You know he lost quite a bit at the horse track after the war. Did he? Said Miss Marple lightly, offering a plate of biscuits. Oh, yes. Nothing formal, of course, but those RAF types. Handsome and dashing, and then peacetime comes and they're all quite at sea. He was living in a flat above the greengrocer's in Marcham. Not what one would call suitable lodgings for a war hero. Miss Marple made a small sound that might have been sympathy, or might have been thought. But what puzzles me, Prue leaned forward, is why anyone would kill him there. In the drawing room, in broad daylight, it doesn't make sense. He wasn't even on the guest list. No, said Miss Marple, knitting needles now at rest in her lap. I thought Mrs. Bradford introduced him around quite deliberately. Called him an old family friend, I believe. Prue blinked. Did she? Yes, said Miss Marple, almost to herself. And she was very careful to let us all know that the dollhouse was hers, a sentimental piece, and yet she never once opened it. She didn't show it to the vicar's twins when they asked. She placed it in the sunniest corner but treated it like a museum relic. Prue stared. Jane, what are you talking about? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, nothing important. Merely that people are often most particular about what they choose to display and what they prefer to hide. The trouble comes when the same object does both at once. Before Prue could respond, the telephone rang, one of those sharp war-era models that always sounded a little too urgent. Miss Marple picked it up. Yes? Oh, good evening, Inspector Creighton. Prue, now alert as a greyhound, sat up. Yes. Yes, I was present. Certainly. I can come in the morning. No trouble at all. I shall bring my notes. Yes, I do take notes. She hung up gently and turned back to her guest, who looked ready to combust from curiosity. Well? Miss Marple folded her hands. Inspector Creighton wishes to speak to all those who were at the tea. He's particularly interested in who last saw the captain before he entered the house. Apparently, no one saw him go in. Prue frowned. But that makes no sense. He had to go through the garden. There were people everywhere. Exactly, said Miss Marple, her voice very quiet now. He was there, and yet somehow no one remembers seeing him arrive. She glanced again toward the window, where the dusk had now fully fallen, and the silhouettes of Larkspur Hollow's tidy houses looked more like shadows than dwellings. Outside, the peaceful illusion of village life continued, but Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that behind each neat hedge and lace curtain, someone was beginning to tremble. Chapter 3. The first clues and suspicions, the following morning dawned clear but with the sharpness of early autumn, a day where the air seemed to bite gently at the skin and the sun never quite warmed the ground. Larkspur Hollow, though awake, moved with the unnatural quiet of a place under watchful eyes. Fern Dell, cordoned off now by thick rope and an officer who looked far too young to be handling murder, had become a destination of whispered glances, and not so subtle, loitering. A small crowd had formed by the hedgerow, Mrs. Cribbs again, this time with a folding chair, Ned Flax with an exaggerated whistle and a bicycle he hadn't ridden all morning, and old Mr. Halberton, who'd brought his dog purely for the excuse of walking back and forth along the lane. Inside the house, Inspector Creighton stood in the drawing-room, eyes narrowed. He was a man of square shoulders and firm tread, but even he looked uncomfortable among the chintz and cream damask. The body had been removed, of course, but the faint outline of Captain Allerton's position on the carpet remained like a ghostly stamp, and the blood had stained down into the fibres despite their efforts. Miss Marple, seated on the edge of an armchair with lace antimacassars, waited politely. She had offered the inspector a boiled sweet from her handbag, which he had declined with confusion and embarrassment, but she had a gift for making men feel rather juvenile by comparison. Now, he consulted a small black notebook. "So," he began, "we've confirmed that Captain Allerton was killed by a deep puncture wound to the neck. Single thrust, very clean, possibly a narrow blade. No one saw the weapon, of course." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But it wasn't likely to be left behind, was it?" Craydon gave her a sidelong look. "We've searched the room thoroughly, and the garden. No sign. Nothing under the divan, behind the curtains, or in the flower beds." "You checked the dollhouse?" Craydon blinked. "The what?" Miss Marple gestured delicately to the far corner, where the ornate dollhouse still stood. It had been placed on a tablecloth again, though not quite the same as yesterday's. The lace one had been taken for evidence. This was a plain muslin cloth. The dollhouse, however, was unchanged. Craydon rose and crossed the room with a grunt, inspecting the miniature property with visible reluctance. He opened the front facade, revealing rooms with delicately upholstered furniture, brass candlesticks, and wallpaper prints so fine they seemed painted by a pin. "There's no blade in the dollhouse," he announced after a moment. "No," said Miss Marple, "but one wonders why it was moved. It's quite heavy, I should think, and surely no one would do that just for symmetry's sake." Craydon frowned. "You're saying someone moved it to hide something?" "Perhaps to reveal something," Miss Marple said, quietly. He looked back at her, clearly undecided whether to thank her or ignore her. Miss Marple adjusted the cuff of her cardigan. "Inspector, you said it was a very clean wound." "Yes. Surgical, almost." "Then a knife or blade that was very narrow, sharp, and easily concealed." "Precisely." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "I once knew a young man, niece's husband's cousin, who trained as a fencing master in Brussels. He carried a collapsible épée in a hollowed-out cane. Quite useful on the continent, apparently. Of course, no one suspected until the matter with the ambassador's dog." Craydon gave her a look of such pure bafflement that Miss Marple relented with a smile. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Perhaps you'll tell me, Inspector, has Mrs. Bradford given her statement?" Craydon's frown deepened. Reluctantly. "She claims she was in the kitchen at the time of the murder, speaking with the cook. But the cook is rather vague on the timing, as are most of the guests, to be honest. It seems everyone lost track of the captain sometime before the raffle." "And no one saw him enter the drawing room?" "No one." He flipped a page. He wasn't on the guest list either. Which raises the question, why was he here at all? Miss Marple's voice was soft. Perhaps he had come to speak with someone, quietly, away from prying eyes. Craydon leaned against the table. "The problem is, no one admits to inviting him. Bradford denies it. Alice Denby said she was surprised to see him, and Mrs. Lestrange claims she thought he was part of the committee. And you?" "I recall Mrs. Bradford introducing him, though not effusively. She said he was an old friend of the family." Craydon scrawled something, then paused. "Did you know the captain before yesterday?" "I had not met him, though I had heard of him." "What did you hear?" Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on the edge of the hearth. "That he was charming and unreliable with money, that he had a fondness for other people's possessions, and that he had once been engaged, unofficially, you understand, to a young woman who left the village rather suddenly." "Name?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Miss Isabel March." Craydon whistled. "March? The solicitor's daughter?" "The very one. She left Larkspur Hollow 5 years ago. Moved up to Oxford, didn't she? After something of a scandal. Quiet, of course, but these things rarely go unnoticed." Craydon tapped his pencil against the notebook. "You're suggesting Captain Allerton had unfinished business?" "I'm merely suggesting that we look carefully at who may have wanted him to disappear." Craydon opened his mouth, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young constable entered, hat in hand. "Inspector, we've finished the inventory of the contents." Craden perked up. "And?" "Nothing missing. All valuables accounted for. No fingerprints on the dollhouse either, or the table it was on." The inspector muttered something under his breath. Miss Marple stood. "Well, I shan't keep you. I suspect your morning will be quite full." Craden looked up. "You're leaving?" "Oh, yes. I've got a call to make on someone I haven't seen in years, and I think I may ask a few questions about dollhouses." She took her handbag from the chair and nodded politely. "Do let me know if anything turns up. And if not, well, one always finds that the truth has a way of dusting itself off." With that, she slipped out the door, leaving Craden staring at the dollhouse again, this time with the faintest glimmer of unease. Chapter 4. Miss Marple quietly observes. It was nearly noon by the time Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, a modest, ivy-framed house that always smelled faintly of beeswax and rosemary. She had made a loaf of seed cake that morning. She found that small gifts often eased conversations, and now she handed it to Alice Denby with a warm smile and no mention at all of the events at Ferndale. Alice looked pale. She had the startled expression of a creature not used to being at the center of anything. Her soft blue dress was a little too large for her, as though she had shrunk since yesterday. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple," she said, trying a smile. "Do come in. I'll just put this in the kitchen." Miss Marple stepped over the threshold slowly, her eyes moving with natural curiosity. She noted the freshly washed floor tiles, the stack of unopened letters by the umbrella stand, and a small scuff on the skirting board. Muddy, recent. When Alice returned, Miss Marple was seated in the sunlit front room, knitting already in hand. "I do hope the inspector wasn't too hard on you," she said gently, eyes never leaving her needles. "Oh, he was quite respectful," Alice said, hesitating, "though it's all very frightening, really. I don't think I've ever seen a dead man before. Not like that." "No," said Miss Marple, "most people haven't. And Captain Allerton was rather a striking man. Very handsome in a certain way." Alice blushed. "Yes, I suppose he was." There was a silence. The click of needles filled it. Then, very casually, "Had you known him before yesterday?" Alice's voice caught. Not exactly. Only from the fete last summer. He'd come with the Pargeters. I think he was distantly related. He danced with me." "Was he kind?" "I thought so then, but afterward, well, he never wrote, and then he left." "I see." Miss Marple's tone was warm, unjudging. "And when he appeared again, unexpectedly at the garden tea, how did that make you feel?" Alice sat very still. I thought perhaps he remembered me, or had something to say. But he didn't look at me, not even once." Miss Marple nodded, still knitting. Men can be terribly obtuse, or cruel when they mean to be charming. Another silence, filled now with shifting light across the carpet. "I didn't kill him," Alice said suddenly. "I didn't even speak to him." Miss Marple looked up, not startled, merely serene. "Of course not, my dear. But you saw him, didn't you, before the scream?" Alice hesitated. "Only for a second. He was crossing the garden. I think he meant to go into the house. I thought perhaps he was looking for Mrs. Bradford." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And you screamed because—" "I opened the drawing-room door. I wanted to see the lacquer boxes she'd mentioned. I'd always been curious, but when I opened the door, he was just lying there." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, of course." She stood, gently closing the needles into her bag. "Thank you, Alice. You've been very kind, and I shall enjoy the tea very much." When she left the vicarage, she did not return home. Instead, she walked with careful steps down Church Lane, past the green, and turned onto the gravel path leading toward Hollycroft Cottage, home of Mrs. Lestrange. Agnes Lestrange was waiting by her window, already pouring a second cup as Miss Marple knocked lightly and let herself in with a practiced familiarity. Gossip, when treated properly, was a kind of science, and Mrs. Lestrange was nothing if not a scholar. "You must tell me what you know," she declared, setting down the sugar bowl with a rattle. "The inspector is too grim to get a word from, and the whole village is turning itself inside out." "I'm afraid I know very little," said Miss Marple gently. "But I was hoping you could help me." Mrs. Lestrange brightened. "Oh, I recall," Miss Marple continued. "You once mentioned that your cousin had worked for the Bradfords in London before the war." Agnes blinked, then nodded slowly. "Yes, Irene. She was a housemaid. Just a year or two. Anthea Bradford wasn't quite so grand then. Married to a property man, rented out villas to foreigners. Bit of a shady reputation, I think. Irene said there were always visitors, and never the same ones twice." "Did she ever mention Captain Allerton?" Agnes thought. "Only once. There was a scene. Raised voices in the study. Irene said it sounded like blackmail." Miss Marple nodded. "And Mrs. Bradford's husband?" "Died suddenly. Car accident, though Irene always thought it was odd. The brakes had failed. Irene was let go shortly afterward." "I see." Miss Marple rose. "You've been most helpful, dear Agnes. Perhaps not a word to the others just yet." Agnes smiled conspiratorially. "Mum's the word." By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the sky was beginning to bruise with late afternoon. She made herself a light supper, boiled egg, toast, and a little pickled beetroot, and sat by the window with her notebook. In neat, spidery script she wrote, "Allerton had ties to Mrs. Bradford before, possibly business or personal. Alice Denby frightened, not guilty, likely disillusioned. Mrs. Bradford never opened the dollhouse. Why display it so prominently, yet leave it untouched? 8 rooms now, 7 before, 1 hidden." She set down her pen. Something about the dollhouse bothered her. Not just its placement or presentation, but its nature. A model of a home tells you something about the one who created it, what they valued, what they wanted to remember or forget. A house with a missing kitchen, a house with a secret room. She glanced at her mantelpiece where a small porcelain dog sat, head tilted as if in thought. "Would you have killed him, old boy?" she asked quietly. "If he threatened to open a door you'd sealed long ago." The dog remained silent, but Miss Marple, wise in the way of both dogs and people, felt the answer all the same. Tomorrow she would visit Ferndale again, this time not to ask questions, but to listen for what the house was trying to say. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The police think it simple. Inspector Creighton was not a man who enjoyed complications. He liked cases that moved in straight lines, with clear motives, visible weapons, and suspects who tripped over their own lies. Unfortunately, murder in Larkspur Hollow was proving disappointingly intricate. On the 3rd morning since the murder, he stood again in Ferndale's drawing room, arms folded, jaw tight. A small stack of evidence bags lay neatly on a side table, mostly containing the mundane. Cigarette stubs, fragments of china from a broken teacup, a crumpled note found near the hallway. None were, in his view, especially useful. But today, he had a name, and more importantly, a motive. Sergeant Webb, eager as ever, stood beside him, flipping open a folder. "Statement from Mr. Chittenden, sir. Says he overheard an argument between Captain Allerton and young Ned Flax last Tuesday. Apparently the captain accused Ned of interfering with his post, something about opening letters that didn't belong to him." Creighton snorted. "Our postman. Bit of a hothead, isn't he?" Webb nodded. "Short temper, poor debts, lives with his mother, and—" He paused with a certain relish. "He has no alibi for the time of the murder. Said he was cycling near the river, but no one saw him. Not even his bicycle shows signs of being used. Well, well. Creighton glanced toward the hallway. Bring him in. Ned Flax entered 10 minutes later, looking like a boy forced to the headmaster's office. He was in his late 20s, all gangly limbs and sunburnt nose, and his voice cracked slightly when he spoke. I didn't do anything, sir. I swear. You argued with the victim. Ned flushed. He said I opened his post. I didn't. Only he'd written to someone, and I saw the envelope. That's all. I didn't read it. But I knew the name. Creighton leaned in. Whose name? Ned hesitated. The lady at Ferndale, Mrs. Bradford. Creighton's eyes narrowed. So the captain and Mrs. Bradford were corresponding? Yes, sir. Regularly, I think. Fancy envelopes, thick paper. He used to wait by the box some mornings. Said the timing mattered. Creighton shared a look with Webb. And what about the morning of the tea? Were you at Ferndale? No, sir. I went riding. Toward the old mill. Anyone see you? No. Ned's jaw tightened. But I didn't kill him. I wouldn't. He was a bit of a cad, yes, but not worth hanging over. Creighton dismissed him with a curt wave, and the constable led Ned out. Well, Webb asked. He's lying about something, Creighton muttered, and the connection to Bradford gives him a reason. Jealousy, blackmail, covering up a scandal. He paused. Still, feels too neat. Just then, the parlor door creaked gently. Miss Marple entered with a quiet smile and a small wicker basket on her arm. So sorry to intrude, Inspector. I brought scones. I find investigations go better when one isn't hungry. Creighton sighed, half defeated. You're impossible to keep out, Miss Marple. Only when invited by the lady of the house, she said, taking a seat. Mrs. Bradford asked me to call. She's dreadfully shaken, of course, but quite determined to continue with the Bell Tower fundraising. A very resilient woman. Creighton sat across from her. Do you believe the boy did it? Ned Flax. Miss Marple tilted her head. I believe young men rarely commit murders in drawing rooms. It's not their style. They're more impulsive, more physical. A fight in an alley, yes. But this was clean, precise, hidden. Do you have someone in mind, then? Oh, no. But I do wonder if you've looked at the dollhouse again. Creighton groaned. What is it with that wretched dollhouse? It's not the dollhouse itself, said Miss Marple, selecting a scone. It's what it represents, a model of an ideal home, but with its own architecture of secrets. You think there's a message hidden in it? Not a message, a memory. Creighton frowned. I don't follow. Mrs. Bradford spoke of it as an heirloom, but in truth, it's not old enough. The paint is barely worn, the floorboards inside, real wood I checked, are hand-finished, not machined. I believe she had it made, or remade, and I believe the hidden room was always part of it, deliberately so. You think it represents something in her past? Miss Marple smiled. Don't we all build doll houses in our minds? Rooms for who we were, who we wanted to be, and the one place we never speak of. Creighton pinched the bridge of his nose. This is not helping. Perhaps not, but if I may, you're focusing too tightly. Meaning? You're looking at one suspect and one motive. But village crimes are like knitting. There's always a dropped stitch somewhere else. Creighton stood. Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll take it under advisement. She smiled again and rose to leave. At the doorway, she turned back. Oh, one more thing. Might I suggest speaking to Mrs. Chittenden? She was near the buffet table during the raffle. She saw something. She hasn't said as much, of course, but she's been quite anxious ever since. Creighton raised an eyebrow. Do you know she saw something? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Only that she's been dusting the tins in her shop with unnecessary vigor. She slipped out, leaving the inspector to stew. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of cut grass Miss Marple walked slowly past the churchyard, pausing briefly by the lich gate. Her eyes were distant, considering Ned Flax was no murderer, nor, she thought, was he blameless. But this murder had not come from jealousy or impulse. No, it had been planned. Planned by someone who had once carefully designed a dollhouse, ensuring one room could vanish completely from view. Chapter 6. A hidden clue. Overlooked, but vital, the Chittendens' shop, quaint and dim, smelled of oiled wood, dusty licorice, and lavender polish. Miss Marple entered quietly just before closing time. The late afternoon light slanted in through the lace-curtained windows, catching on jars of barley sugar and neatly stacked tins of Devon cream. Mrs. Chittenden, round-shouldered and anxious-eyed, was behind the counter pretending to count cough lozenges. She looked up with a start. "Oh, Miss Marple, how nice. Just closing, I'm afraid. Didn't expect customers this late." "I won't stay long," said Miss Marple with her most amiable smile. "Only thought I might pick up a bit of your lavender soap, the kind with flecks of oats in it. You still keep it by the tea canisters?" "Just there, yes." Mrs. Chittenden's voice trembled slightly. Miss Marple moved to the shelf, but did not pick up the soap. She turned instead with a gentle expression. "Terrible business the other day. Captain Allerton, it's left us all unsettled." Mrs. Chittenden nodded quickly. Too quickly. "Terrible, terrible. Such a shame. You knew him, of course?" "Well, only a little." He kept to himself. Dashing, though. Always seemed like a man with secrets. Miss Marple let the silence linger just long enough. "Then, you were near the buffet table, I believe, just before the raffle began. Near enough to see who filled the decanter?" Mrs. Chittenden blinked. What do you mean?" "The sherry. It was poisoned, wasn't it? I'm not suggesting you know anything improper, of course, only that you might have noticed something." Mrs. Chittenden flushed deeply, then turned away to busy herself with a tin of powdered cocoa. I did see someone. Only for a moment. I didn't think it mattered. It may matter very much." The woman took a deep breath. It was Miss Rhoda Kent. She was alone in the drawing room. I saw her lift the decanter. She looked at it, then set it down again. Then she added something to her glass. A little bottle. From her coat. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Did she drink it?" "No, she put it back. I assume she changed her mind." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very helpful." As she left the shop, Miss Marple felt the first threads of a new pattern winding together. Rhoda Kent, a harmless girl on the surface. Bookish, awkward, prone to sudden silences, but perhaps not as innocuous as she seemed. Still, there was another matter nagging at her. Not the murder itself, but something peripheral. A detail from the dollhouse that hadn't left her mind since she'd inspected it again that morning with Mrs. Bradford's indulgent permission. The dollhouse room was gone, but what lingered was not absence, but residue. Inside the miniature hallway, beside the tiny door that now opened to a blank wall, there had been a faint trace of something, a smear, almost invisible, except that Miss Marple had once worked in a Red Cross dispensary and had seen it before. Syrup of ipecac, a mild emetic, bitter, unpleasant, but easily confused with any number of herbal tinctures, and harmless in small quantities. Which begged the question, why had it been inside a child's model? She made her way up the lane toward the church. There, the vicar was just locking up after evening prayer. He greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Marple, you missed a very moving hymn." "I shall repent at leisure," she smiled back. "Tell me, Reverend, have you ever officiated a service for Rhoda Kent's family?" "Rhoda?" He looked surprised. "No, I don't believe so. She lives with her aunt, doesn't she? Miss Temple?" "Yes, and the aunt, a churchgoer." Very quiet woman. Keeps to herself. Hasn't been to service in months. Perhaps ill health. Miss Marple nodded. And did you know if Rhoda had siblings? I believe she had a brother. Died young. A car accident years ago. That, Miss Marple thought, was not a detail often volunteered. It had the ring of something quietly mourned. She walked back home slowly, her thoughts swirling. The dollhouse, the decanter. Rhoda Kent, all turning like gears, not yet locking into place. That evening she hosted her dear friend Mrs. Godfrey for tea. The older woman, a chatty widow, had once served as governess to 3 of the village children and knew more gossip than the local paper. I do wonder, Miss Marple asked lightly as they took their second cups, did Rhoda Kent ever show any interest in poison? I mean academically. Mrs. Godfrey blinked. Oh yes. She wrote a paper about it in school, actually. Something about the history of poisons in literature. Her teacher was quite alarmed, but I thought it very clever. Indeed. She always had that eerie calm about her. Never cried in front of others, even at her brother's funeral. Some thought it strange. Miss Marple listened carefully, filing away each word. By the time she returned to Ferndale the next morning, Inspector Creighton was already there, fuming. She was seen near the decanter, he said as she stepped in. We're holding Miss Kent overnight. Found a small bottle in her room, traces of digitalis. Said it was for a science experiment. Digitalis, murmured Miss Marple. From foxglove. Quite bitter, unmistakable in taste. And lethal, Miss Marple nodded. But not untraceable, and not subtle. Captain Allerton was a man of taste. He wouldn't drink something so bitter without remarking. Creighton frowned. Then what do you suggest? That perhaps someone wanted us to see Rhoda Kent, to believe in her guilt, a red herring, as they say in thrillers. Creighton rubbed his temples. So we're back to the drawing board. Not entirely, said Miss Marple. Because the person who made the dollhouse, Inspector, may have made the same mistake twice. A missing room is hard to ignore. But what was in that room once? Creighton stared at her. You think it held something vital? I think it held a memory. One someone wished to erase. She paused. I should like to speak to Miss Temple, Rhoda's aunt. Quiet women often see the most. And then, under her breath, she added, and bury the deepest. Chapter 7. The Memory That Was Removed. The Temple household was a quiet place on the northern edge of St. Hedwig's parish, tucked behind an iron gate almost always left ajar. The house itself was modest, of faded brick and dark ivy, and its front door opened to a stillness that felt not merely domestic, but ceremonial, like a place where conversation had long since given way to ritual silence. Miss Marple was ushered inside by a frail, soft-spoken housemaid and shown into a sitting room that looked almost untouched by time. Every object had been placed with care and, more tellingly, left undisturbed. A lace antimacassar perched perfectly on the back of an unused armchair. A vase of wax flowers stood stiffly on the windowsill, unfaded by sun. The atmosphere was one of suspended breath. Miss Temple entered with slow steps, a thin woman in her 60s with neatly pinned white hair and the expression of someone who had once loved deeply and never recovered. Her hands were folded in front of her with precise gentility, but her eyes betrayed a ceaseless inner vigilance. I expected someone, she said softly, but not you. I thought perhaps we might speak, Miss Temple, Miss Marple said, offering no smile this time, only a quiet steadiness. About Rhoda. Miss Temple did not sit. She walked slowly to the hearth and rested one hand on the mantel, staring at a cold porcelain clock. She's a good girl, she said finally. Misunderstood, perhaps, but good. I'm sure you believe so. I'm also sure you have tried very hard to protect her. Miss Temple blinked, but did not look away from the clock. The loss of her brother, Miss Marple continued, was a tragedy, but it happened long ago. What happened more recently, Miss Temple, was murder. The older woman's hand twitched. I don't believe Rhoda poisoned Captain Allerton, Miss Marple went on, her tone gentle but firm. But someone certainly arranged for suspicion to fall upon her, and I think that someone counted on a certain pattern being repeated, a pattern of silence, of erasure. Miss Temple turned slowly. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. The room held its breath. Miss Marple took a seat on the edge of a stiff-backed chair. I visited the dollhouse again yesterday, the one Rhoda donated to the raffle. A very detailed piece. Too detailed, in fact, for one particular error to be accidental. Miss Temple said nothing, but her gaze flickered. One room is missing. A bedroom, likely. The door is there, but it opens into a blank wall, and beside that door there was a faint residue of syrup of ipecac. Not poison, but something associated with illness. And purging. I don't... Miss Marple held up a hand. I don't accuse you of anything criminal, Miss Temple. But I believe a memory was locked away in that dollhouse, a memory Rhoda wanted to forget, and someone helped her do so. Miss Temple's composure cracked just faintly. She sat down heavily across from Miss Marple and folded her hands tightly together in her lap. She was only 12, she said, and her brother, Arthur, he was already troubled. Brilliant, but dark. He would speak of death, of rituals, of little games. Miss Marple listened without a word. He was obsessed with stories. Ghost stories, murder trials. He made Rhoda help him stage them. Harmless at first, mock trials with their dolls. But later, things changed. He began to talk about real crimes, about poisons. Her voice thinned. One day, Rhoda was found in bed, violently ill. No one could determine the cause. I found a bottle under her pillow, ipecac. When I confronted Arthur, he said she'd wanted to try it, that she was training herself. But Rhoda swore she hadn't known, that he'd dared her to drink a tonic without telling her what it was. Miss Temple's voice broke. He was institutionalized 2 months later and killed in a car crash before he could be released. Rhoda never spoke of it again. I burned every book he owned. She never forgave me. Miss Marple's hands rested gently on the arm of her chair. And the dollhouse. She made it when she was 17, said it helped her forget. But she sealed the bedroom with glue and paint as though it had never existed. She was trying to erase the part of her life connected to Arthur. But someone remembered, Miss Marple said softly. Miss Temple nodded slowly. Captain Allerton, he knew Arthur, they were cousins. That struck a chord Miss Marple had not expected. Cousins. Yes, distant, but they saw each other during summers. I never made the connection at first, but when Rhoda saw him at the fete. She went white. He smiled at her in a way that, well, she refused to speak to him after that. So she added ipecac to her glass, Miss Marple murmured. Perhaps as a symbol, perhaps even intending to feign illness. A protest, not a murder. Miss Temple's eyes met hers. But someone else saw her do it, and took the opportunity to poison the sherry afterward, making Rhoda appear the culprit. Miss Marple stood. Thank you, Miss Temple. I do not think Rhoda is the guilty party, but I do believe Captain Allerton's past, Arthur's past, has finally returned, like a faint stain on wallpaper that no amount of whitewash can cover. Miss Temple rose as well, slowly. Do you think this will save her? Miss Marple looked into the woman's worn, sorrowful face. I think it may save you both. Outside, the sky had darkened. Miss Marple walked with purpose, her stride quickening as she crossed the village green. The picture was becoming clearer now. Only a few strokes remained to complete the scene. But one question gnawed at her still. Who among the fete's guests had known enough of Arthur Kent's story and Rhoda's forgotten shame to twist it into a weapon, Miss Marple stopped, mid-step, as the answer took shape. Not someone who had simply heard the tale, someone who had watched it unfold, closely, carefully, and perhaps from above. Not just a witness, an observer. Chapter 8. The One Who Watched from Above. 1,143 words. The rain began that night just before dusk, a soft, misting drizzle that crept through hedges and glistened on cobblestone walks like a memory refusing to be buried. Miss Marple, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, sat once again in the parlour of Mrs. Ellie Dunstrom. The woman's house, half a block from the green, overlooked the site where the fete had been held only days before. From her upper windows, one had a perfect view of the little tents, the trestle tables, the raffle booths, and, more importantly, the people who wandered through them. "You watched the fete from up here, didn't you, Mrs. Dunstrom?" Miss Marple asked with her usual softness, but her eyes missed nothing. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Dunstrom replied airily, offering the old detective a saucer of shortbread. "I do every year, from my back room." "Lovely vantage point." "I imagine it is. Did you use your opera glasses?" "Always," she smiled. "My eyesight is worse now, and I like to see who wins what. This year's dollhouse drew such attention. I rather fancied it myself, but the ticket queue was rather long." Miss Marple took a shortbread with a murmur of thanks, then waited, letting silence settle like dust in the corners. She had found that quiet was not merely a tool, it was a mirror, and Mrs. Dunstrom, as always, could not help glancing into it. It was quite something, that moment when poor Captain Allerton collapsed. I saw him take the glass. It was the third one. He rejected the first two, oddly. Then he turned and toasted the committee. "Oh?" Miss Marple's voice was light. "And who served the glasses?" "Well, Miss Felice brought the tray, that charming girl with the fox brooch. She placed it on the table. I do recall Rhoda Kent approaching it after a time, fiddling with something behind the cloth. I thought nothing of it, but the captain chose his own." "So no one handed it to him?" "No, he was particular. Picked it out himself. Quite deliberately, if I may say so." Miss Marple turned to look out the lace-draped window, her eyes scanning the churchyard and trees beyond. "It's funny, isn't it, how clearly we can see others from a distance, but rarely do they see us." Mrs. Dunstrom chuckled. "Oh, yes. A blessing, really. I observe all kinds of things from up here. Domestic squabbles, sneaky lovers, the baker's boy having more than just buns with the vicar's daughter." Miss Marple smiled thinly. "And you saw Rhoda Kent with the glass. Did you also see the moment the poison was added?" Mrs. Dunstrom blinked just slightly. "Why, no. I saw her lean down near the table. Then I looked away. I think I saw Miss Purley arguing with Mrs. Leverett near the lemonade cart. That distracted me." "How long were you looking away?" Mrs. Dunstrom grew still. "Oh, just a moment." "And yet it was enough," Miss Marple murmured, "for someone to slip something into one of those glasses, after Rhoda had finished with hers. A very narrow window, but not impossible." Mrs. Dunstrom pressed her fingers against her lips. Could have been anyone. Or someone who knew exactly when to act. Someone who saw Rhoda tampering, knew she was creating a scene of suspicion, and used it. "I never thought—" Miss Marple rose gently. "Your window gives you much, Mrs. Dunstrom, but it does not protect you from truth. I think you've seen more than you've admitted. Perhaps not out of malice. Perhaps you believed, as others do, that some secrets protect more than they hurt." Mrs. Dunstrom stood abruptly, brushing crumbs from her blouse. "It's not that I meant to mislead. But it's such a quiet village, Miss Marple. Things go on beneath the surface, you know, and it's often best not to stir them. Until someone dies." Mrs. Dunstrom flinched. Miss Marple gave her a slow, sad look. "It isn't just about who placed the poison. It's about who knew enough to use Rhoda as a vessel. That requires intimacy, history, Someone who knew about her brother's illness and her shame. Mrs. Dunstrom hesitated, then walked to her mantel. From beneath a stack of letter writing paper, she drew a slim envelope. This came in the post the morning after the fete. No return address. She handed it to Miss Marple, whose fingers received it carefully. Inside was a clipping from a 10-year-old provincial newspaper. An obituary. Arthur Kent, age 17, dies in high-speed crash while under psychiatric care. Below it, someone had underlined 2 lines in red ink. He leaves behind a grieving family, including his younger sister, Rhoda Kent. Arthur Kent had been under clinical observation for compulsive fantasies and chemical experimentation. No signature, no note, only the truth, sent like a weapon. Someone wanted the story dragged back, Miss Marple said, reading the lines again. Someone who perhaps feared it had faded too far. Mrs. Dunstrom's voice shook. You think that's what Captain Allerton was doing, reviving it? Miss Marple nodded. Or using it. But someone else used him to send a final message. She tucked the clipping back into its envelope and slipped it into her bag. The drizzle outside had turned to a proper rain now, drumming faintly against the windows like a quiet ticking of conscience. There's only one thing left to know, she said quietly. Who among those present had access to both the dollhouse and this article? Mrs. Dunstrom sat down, hard as though she had suddenly grown old. Miss Marple let her sit in the stillness, then turned for the door. She would go next to the raffle books. She needed to see who had handled the dollhouse before it was set up, who had taken it from Rhoda's hands and perhaps examined it a little too closely. Because someone had noticed the missing room, someone who had once lived in a house with a door that led nowhere. Chapter 9. The drawer beneath the dolls. The dollhouse sat in the back room of the vicarage now, resting solemnly atop a polished oak table, far from the chattering children who had once tugged at its miniature doors and windows. Reverend Halsey had kept it safe under Miss Marple's instruction after the fete had turned from festive to fatal. The clergyman had even dusted it once or twice, though he confessed to Miss Marple, when she arrived just after breakfast, that he did so with unease. It gives me a feeling, Miss Marple, he said gravely. As though the thing knows too much. Strange, isn't it? For a toy. Miss Marple, who had long understood the quiet echoes in inanimate objects, gave him a thoughtful nod. Strange, yes, but not unheard of. She circled the dollhouse slowly. Sunlight streamed in through the vicarage's stained-glass side window, throwing prisms of color across the tiny chimneys and shutters. The house had once belonged to Rhoda Kent's childhood, a lovingly detailed reproduction of the Kent family estate in Oxfordshire. But there was one problem. It was incomplete, and not merely in a child's way. Not in the way of missing figurines or worn wallpaper. No, this was precise, calculated. An entire room, the Eastern study, had been omitted, or rather, removed. Miss Marple leaned closer to the right-hand side, her fingers trailing along the fine grain of the mahogany roof. She knew from Rhoda's account that the original house had 5 rooms on the ground floor. This model had only 4. Where the Eastern study should have been, there was a suspicious expanse of blank wall. "Do you see it, Reverend?" she asked gently. The vicar peered down, adjusting his glasses. Yes, I do. A false facade, perhaps? Was the house built like this from the start?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Rhoda told me she made the original sketch herself as a child. Her father commissioned a carpenter in Exeter to build it exactly. This side should have opened into a 5th room, a study with 2 red chairs and a grandfather clock. But look, this wall is smooth, freshly painted." She drew a small penknife from her handbag, discreetly, as though it were a moral compromise, and gently tapped the wall with its flat edge. A hollow sound. She glanced up at the vicar. "Would you mind?" "Not at all," said Reverend Halsey, already pulling on his gardening gloves. He worked the edge of the blade beneath the baseboard. With a soft pop, the panel gave way, and a small, dust-lined drawer slid free from beneath the missing room. It had been carefully concealed beneath the floor. Inside the drawer was a rolled scrap of wallpaper, the kind used in the rest of the dollhouse, a shard of broken mirror, a lock of auburn hair tied with pale green ribbon, and something more modern. A miniature bottle, no larger than a thimble, with a dark red residue at the bottom. Miss Marple did not touch the contents. She only stared. Reverend Halsey frowned. "Poison?" Miss Marple's lips were a firm line. "I believe so. But why hide it here? And the other things, surely they belong to—" He trailed off, the implications settling into the quiet of the room. "This was a shrine," Miss Marple murmured. "Or a confession." She looked again at the shard of mirror. It was angled, its edges carefully dulled. A child might use such a thing to peek at what cannot be seen directly, to observe, or to spy. Someone used this drawer to remember, perhaps even to rehearse. Miss Marple gently closed the drawer again and slid it back into place. The dollhouse, now that she saw it fully, was more than a toy. It was a map of a wound, one someone had preserved for years, nursing its pain, perhaps feeding its justification. And then, when the right moment came, when the fete returned and Rhoda Kent with it, they had brought the house back too. But they altered it, removed the room where it had happened, where the thing that scarred them had occurred, the study. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the clipping Mrs. Dunstrom had given her. Arthur Kent, the brother who died under psychiatric care after a terrible incident. Rhoda had not spoken of him often, but the signs were there. Her anxiety, her skittishness, her unwillingness to speak of childhood. And then Miss Marple remembered something else. The drawing Rhoda had shown her, her childhood sketch of the dollhouse layout. She had included one very specific detail, a small figure in the study window. She had said it was Arthur watching. Who else might have known that? Miss Marple turned. "Reverend, may I see your fate volunteer roster, the original one, before the committee assignments?" The vicar moved to his desk and produced a folder, dog-eared and full of notes. Miss Marple scanned the list quickly, her finger tracing names. There, beneath the section for setup and transport, was a name she'd nearly forgotten. Elsa Hambley. She hadn't been on the committee or visible at the fete itself, but she had assisted the day before, helping move the larger prize items from the Kent home to the church hall. Rhoda had been away that day, giving a talk at the Literary Society. Elsa, Miss Marple mused aloud. She was Rhoda's governess, wasn't she? Years ago. The vicar blinked. Indeed, my word, I'd quite forgotten. Took care of the children after Mrs. Kent passed, left town after the boy died. And now she's back. Miss Marple stared at the dollhouse once more. The missing room, the hidden drawer, the bottle. Not vengeance, she whispered to herself. Punishment, carried out by someone who believed they had watched long enough. The dollhouse stood silent and motionless, but Miss Marple could almost feel it pulse with memory. Chapter 10. The Room That Was Never Missing. Elsa Hambley lived in a narrow stone cottage behind the station, ivy crawling up the windows like careful fingers pulling closed a curtain. Miss Marple, armed with a tin of almond biscuits and a handbag heavier than usual, arrived just after the noon bells, having telephoned earlier with the gentlest of tones. "I always thought of you fondly, Elsa," she had said, "and I have something rather curious to ask you about an old dollhouse." The door opened even before Miss Marple knocked. Elsa's hair had turned white, but her posture remained upright, rigid almost, like a woman who had long practiced being composed. Her eyes, blue and steady, flickered briefly when she saw the elderly lady on her doorstep. "Miss Marple," she said. "Do come in." The cottage was modest and clean. A kettle whistled on the stove. A tea tray had already been set with 2 cups and a single plate. There were no biscuits. "You always did anticipate things well," Miss Marple said as she settled into a chair by the fire. Elsa smiled faintly. Old governess habit. They sipped tea in silence for a time. Then Miss Marple reached into her handbag and placed a tiny bottle on the table, the same one from the drawer beneath the dollhouse. Elsa's gaze rested on it. She did not speak. "You knew about the missing room," said Miss Marple softly. A long pause. "I built the new panel myself," Elsa said at last. Rhoda never noticed. She thought she was looking at her childhood dollhouse, but it was mine now, in a way. Miss Marple nodded. "And in that drawer, the lock of hair, the mirror, the wallpaper, each a fragment of a truth no one wanted spoken." Elsa looked down at her hands. "Arthur wasn't violent," she said. "He was frightened, misunderstood. But he saw things. He saw everything in that house, especially what Mr. Kent did when Mrs. Kent wasn't looking." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers tensed slightly on her teacup. "Rhoda never knew," Elsa continued. "She was too young, but Arthur did. He used to sit in that study with the door closed, looking out the window with that little spy mirror I made for him. He told me one day, told me what he saw. I begged the authorities. No one listened. Not then. They thought Arthur was unstable. He was institutionalized a month later. A silence followed that no clock ticked through. I left the family after that," Elsa whispered. "I couldn't bear to see what they'd done to that boy. When Rhoda brought the dollhouse to the fete all these years later, I recognized it instantly, but I also saw an opportunity." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "You tampered with the raffle?" Elsa nodded. "It was supposed to go to the mayor's daughter. I made sure it ended up with Evelyn Dunstrom," Miss Marple said gently, "because you suspected Evelyn knew something. She was the only other person who used to sneak into the Kent household as a child. Rhoda's best friend, always playing with the dollhouse. Arthur trusted her, I think. He must have confided in her too, but she kept it secret, perhaps out of fear or shame. I don't know. But she helped bury that room." Miss Marple understood now. The missing room in the dollhouse was not merely a vanished architectural feature. It was a symbol of silence, of secrets deliberately walled up like corpses behind plaster. "You placed the poison in the house," she said gently. "I only meant to scare her," Elsa said, "just enough to make her remember. The memories, the shame, sometimes they're worse than any punishment. But when she fell ill, I panicked. I fled the fate." Miss Marple nodded. "And the mirror? Why include that?" Elsa gave a faint, brittle smile. "Because the truth, Miss Marple, always reflects itself. If you stare long enough, it comes back to you." A knock sounded on the door. Elsa didn't flinch. Miss Marple rose and opened it herself. Detective Inspector Cray stood on the step, hat in hand, his usual gruffness subdued by the weight of understanding. "Miss Hambley," he said quietly, "we'll need you to come with us." Elsa rose, smoothing her skirt. "I understand." But as she passed Miss Marple, she paused. "Rhoda doesn't know," she said, "and I want it kept that way." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "She needn't know. That particular room shall remain locked." 2 days later, Rhoda Kent visited Miss Marple in St. Mary Mead. Her face was pale, her eyes clouded with unspoken fears. "I don't understand," she said. "Elsa, arrested, for tampering with the dollhouse. They say it made Evelyn sick, that she'll recover now. But why would Elsa do such a thing?" Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea, stirring the sugar in quietly. "Perhaps," she said, "Elsa remembered something painful, something from long ago. and perhaps she wished someone else would remember too. Rhoda looked confused, but she didn't press further. "I always loved that house," she said wistfully. "Even with all its oddities, it made me feel safe, like everything had its place." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Sometimes, my dear," she said, "we build rooms not to live in, but to forget what happened there." Rhoda blinked, but then she smiled weakly and sipped her tea. The dollhouse had been removed from the vicarage and placed in police custody, though Miss Marple suspected it would eventually be returned. Perhaps Rhoda would never open that drawer. Perhaps no one ever would again. But Miss Marple knew it was no longer needed. The story had been told. The mirror had reflected. The missing room had been found, not in the dollhouse, but in the hearts of those who had once refused to look. And now, it could finally be left behind.